of people. And so the aspect to utility, now I don't know, this is a pretty clear-cut example, and it's not clear to me that utilitarians necessarily will do evil things in order to find a greater good. I'm not really sure about that, but we recognize that utility basically is open to this possibility because its concern is for the larger society, not those individuals that have to suffer for that greater good. So that's an issue that we have here. So that kind of completes at least the aspects of the map that I put around the edges. And as you can see in utilitarian ethics, there's one supreme principle of morality. An act is right or wrong depending on the total good or evil it produces. It's a greater amount of good than it's worth what you need to do to get it. And utilitarian ethics is therefore also referred to as consequentialist. So the concern for a utilitarian is the end result. What are the consequences of this action? That's what we're shooting for. And it's kind of interesting that justice implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. You owe me a living. You owe me a basic income. For example, Charles Murray. Charles Murray. Do that. I don't know if the society will be better off if everyone has at least a basic income. And by the way, we have comparisons. Charles Murray is a libertarian. We haven't talked about that yet. A liberal is an example of Mill, or Mill is a liberal. If you're a utilitarian, the classic sense of liberal, and actually Mill gives us that in his book. On liberty, I believe he co-wrote with his wife, Harriet Taylor. Okay, so this is on liberty. So this is the book that gives us the concept of liberty. What is it, 1850? Does it say? I don't see where it's indicated. But in any case, I think it's 1859 actually, because 1859 is the same year that Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. It's also the same year that Mill published On Liberty. So 1859 roughly. Remember, that's a year before the Civil War broke out in the United States. So time frame. By the way, Charles Darwin's birthday and Abraham Lincoln's birthday are the same, the exact same day. So you're kind of politically involved if you attend either a celebration of Lincoln's birthday, while at the same time across town there's a Charles Darwin Day going on. So which side are you? That's just so you know. However, and I have to throw this in, Mendelssohn, Felix auf Deutsch, happy, Felicidad, Merry Christmas. It's Latin actually, but if we think of Mendelssohn, Felix, misspelled. Actually, his last name was Bartholdi. But we usually don't say that in English. But you're very familiar with at least one melody from Bartholdi or Felix, right? Bum 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 bum. Yes? Everybody? Well, I actually had that melody play at my actual wedding. But for some reason, even though it was playing, I didn't really spend too much time thinking about it. Whatever. However, Mendelssohn. By the way, one of the reasons that Mendelssohn is so important is because he reinvented Bach. So if you're familiar with John Sebastian, which is the name I usually use for the toilet, the Johann Sebastian, which is just a funny joke in my house. But it used to be John. We used to call it a John. And the reason we called it a John was because the British were making fun of King John, who they didn't like. So they turned what they used to call a Jakes to a John. Linguistic. Sorry, it's pretty close. However, okay, that's another thing. But so Felix Mendelssohn, interesting music. I'll end talking about Mill by pointing out that while Mill was an elderly gent, he was friends with a young man named Bertrand Russell, and so there's a physical direct connection between them, not related, but friends. And I've mentioned this just real quick. This is an example of Bertrand Russell's thinking. Bertrand Russell may be considered to be one of the greatest British philosophers, although I've talked with Brits and they don't really know who they would think. Could be John Locke, David Hume was really a Scotsman, but who would be the greatest? But Bertrand Russell's clearly up there, and this is kind of a neat thing to indicate kind of a very post-Hegelian point of view. Do not feel absolutely certain of anything. That's utility, right? Because the nature of science, funeral by funeral, science progresses. What do they mean, funeral? So you have a thesis or a theory, a hypothesis, and you think, yes, that's right, and then someone disproves it, and you have to move on to a new hypothesis. So funeral by funeral, science progresses. So you get this whole sense of don't feel absolutely certain of anything. Do not think it worthwhile to proceed by concealing evidence, for the evidence is sure to come to light. Never try to discourage thinking, for you are sure to succeed. When you meet with opposition, even if it should be from your husband or your children, endeavor to overcome it by argument and not by authority. For a victory dependent upon authority is unreal and illusory. Have no respect for the authority of others, for there are always contrary authorities to be found. Do not use power to suppress opinions you think pernicious, for if you do, the opinions will suppress you. Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. Find more pleasure in intelligent dissent than in passive agreement, for if you value intelligence as you should, the former implies a deeper agreement than the latter. Be scrupulously truthful even if the truth is inconvenient, for it is more inconvenient when you try to conceal it. Do not feel envious of the happiness of those who live in a fool's paradise, for only a fool will think that it is happiness. So that's kind of Bertrand Russell in a nutshell. I'd like to see him in person.
I'm preparing to speak about this. human nature in politics about the kind of
Well, rats.
rule passes as men.
Here we go. Let's. You can actually see him speaking that. I believe. I've watched it. Where is it?
Våra tankar till vår bortgångne konung. Nobelpristagarna ställer in åtföljda av sina introducörer. Att slå broar.
Am I in the wrong one? Rats. Manchester. Maybe it wasn't. No, I don't think it was in Manchester.
So Simon, David is to try to find expedients to prevent the
All
world.
right, I'll quit looking for it. But I've watched it. You can watch the actual speech, Nobel Prize lecture. It is a little longish, but he's hilarious. It's fascinating. This is after World War II, for example, and he says, what was the average cost of killing a German in World War II? Because you could figure out how much the Brits spent on the war and how many Germans died. So basically you could calculate how much it cost per person to kill a German. And he was a peace proponent, anti-war. Fascinating. So Bertrand Russell, have a look at him if you get a chance. Okay, so let's move on to the main topic for today. Another post-Hegelian. I mentioned Mill was slightly younger, although remember he lived a lot longer. He lived a nice long life. Kierkegaard notoriously lived only a short life of 42 years. And I'm actually serious about saying warning. This is the only trigger warning I actually have embedded on my website for any of the philosophers, but seriously, studying the following philosopher may be dangerous for your mental health. Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, by the way, is a word that means churchyard in Danish. And churchyard is a cemetery. And how did the family get that name? They were granted to live in the house that was on the cemetery. And so they began being referred to as the Kierkegaard. Okay. If you're a fan of Stephen King, and you know just the horror of living on top of all those dead bodies, although the house wasn't really on the graves, it was in the area of the graves. Denmark, Lutheran, youngest son. His father believed that the family was cursed because of something the father had done when he was a young man. He basically cursed God because of the poverty of his life and so on. And he felt that ever since he did that, God had it in for him, and that all of his children would die early, and they did. So the whole family all thought we're condemned, basically. But nonetheless, they were Lutheran. He's interested in the Lutheran Church, preparing himself essentially for becoming a Lutheran minister, even is preparing to marry his expected bride, Regina. I remember when I was in college and reading him, one of the things that annoyed me the absolute most was his book, The Diary of a Seducer. And in this book, he lays out the plan, how to best seduce a woman, and step by step, he has this kind of scientific method of how to seduce a woman. And he follows this. You'd have to read the book to see the step-by-step process, but once you get to the point where she's become now completely infatuated with you, and you invite her to join you at 3 in the morning in a cab out, in the park. And the cab comes to pick her up. She comes out of the house secretly with her luggage, gets into the cab, and the cab driver drives the horses out to the park, and they sit there and wait, and you're supposed to join her and basically run off together, and you don't show up. Because what you wanted to try to do was to get her to do that. And you succeeded, so you're done. So you leave her sitting there at night in the park with no idea. Where's Surin? Never shows up. Now that's a fictional story, but in real life, he did something quite similar. 2 weeks before the marriage, he said, change of heart, I'm not going to marry. And so he quit. Within 2 years, she found someone else to marry and married him, and he was furious. How could you marry someone else if you loved me? Hateful guy. By the way, they didn't have it at the time, but the belief by some is that he was bipolar. And if you're familiar with bipolarity, individuals have manic depressive cycles, and that really seems to fit him, although of course it's not really proper for you to diagnose him from 100 years or more away, but nonetheless they kind of seem pretty in agreement that he definitely had something wrong with him, because he would go through these manic periods where he would be just absolutely exuberant and write all kinds of things. And by the way, Exuberant is the name of a book on this. And in fact, you can listen to Kay talking about it.
The daffodil, and you have 2 minutes to come up with as many associations to the word daffodil as you can. You can score that person on national norms of both the total number of responses